Hello, this talk is called Individual Responsibility for Environmental Norms, and I'm going to get straight into it. So the question I want to address in this talk is what should be the primary content or focus of individuals looking to perform their climate-related obligations? So which objects in our social ontology, if you like, should such individuals focus on? And the answer that I want to argue for is that they should focus on promoting social norms, specifically anti-fossil fuel norms, to some extent at the expense of kind of more private sphere actions. So the first step in the argument is to argue that offsetting and other private sphere actions rely on a false private-public dichotomy that's indefensible, and therefore focusing on offsetting or other private sphere actions like merely reducing individual consumption without a view to the broader social ramifications are inadequate. Okay, so first of all, I want to say something about why you might think offsetting is an adequate individual level response to the climate crisis. So climate harms are linearly related to the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, which makes it possible to offset enough that it's as if one has emitted nothing at all. So if you pay enough to offsetting projects, you can kind of effectively wipe out any emissions that you do, even if you continue to indulge in extremely luxurious emissions. And at current offsetting prices, this can be done pretty cheaply. So it can be done at the cost of about $20,000 US over the course of a lifetime for the average individual living in industrialized societies. Yet I hope it's pretty clear that there's something quite wrong intuitively with offsetting. And I take it the rough intuition is something like this. The average affluent lifestyle needs dramatic reform if we are to mitigate climate change, and offsetting can be done without any such reform. All you need to do is pay 20 grand over the course of your life, and you can have as luxurious and high emitting a life as you want. So it seems like offsetting goes wrong somewhere. It's a bit unclear where, though. I think it goes wrong in two places. And the second of these places is something that generalizes to kind of private sphere, I'll define that in a minute, actions more generally, beyond just offsetting. So the first problem with offsetting is that offsetters benefit from an injustice. So you can see this by taking the assumption, for the sake of argument, that the extent of our climate-related obligations is to offset our emissions. And we look around the current world and we see that many people aren't fulfilling these obligations. This means that the people who do fulfill those obligations benefit from that injustice. They benefit in the form of cheaper offsets. Offsetting is cheaper, the fewer people do it. Because the fewer people do it, the more offsetting can just rely on kind of low-hanging fruit, can rely on cheap interventions, such as replacing cooking equipment in developing countries with more efficient cooking equipment, for example. Okay, so current offsetters benefit from an injustice. They benefit from the fact that others do nothing for the climate, and they benefit in the form of cheaper offsetting. So that means that even if you assume, kind of as a starting gate theory, that our only obligations are to offset, in the current world we're going to end up with more obligations because we're going to get these obligations by benefiting from injustice. That is, offsetters are going to get those obligations. Okay, so that's the first reason why offsetting is insufficient. Second reason, and this is kind of deeper, and it shows that offsetting isn't just insufficient, but also is perhaps even problematic or shouldn't be done. Offsetting is only a partial solution. So it's a solution that can only be enacted at the individual level. And you can see this by thinking about the fact that if everyone offset, it would fail as an institution, because if everyone did it, it would be too expensive, and it, the system would break down. It would be unsustainable. People wouldn't be able to afford it. So offsetting is only a solution that works as long as a few people offset, and then the rest of our climate mitigation strategy is going to have to be political level intervention. So offsetting needs to come along with other mitigation or adaptation strategies too. Now, this is acknowledged by philosophical defenders of offsetting. I'm focusing here on Broome, but I'm happy to talk about other people in the comments if people want. So Broome, quite famously in his popular 2012 book, distinguishes private morality from public morality. So private morality applies to individuals. It demands that individuals don't do harm. Public morality applies to governments, and it demands that governments do good. So private individuals then do all that they need to do when they offset. Governments, though, have to do more. I think there are problems, though, with any attempt to divide climate ethics neatly into a kind of private sphere and a public sphere in this way. And it's worth noting that Broome isn't the only philosopher who makes such a division between private morality and public morality. So Dale Jameson also makes such a division, although he divides it in a slightly different way than Broome, so he focuses on individual virtue. But in any case, this division between private and public morality of climate change is fairly common. I think it's problematic. I think it is problematic because we can draw a parallel between climate justice and gender justice. So famously, in feminist ethics, the personal is political. One discussion of this comes through in Susan Moller-Oken's critique of John Rawls in her book, Justice, Gender and the Family. She outlines 4 ways in which the gender personal is the gender political. I think there are parallel ways in which the climate personal is the climate political. And this is these 4 ways. So first of all, decisions in private life are not exempt from exactly the considerations that generate the government's obligation to do good. So if you think, as people like Broome and Jameson do, that the government's obligation to mitigate and adapt to climate change is grounded in the government's capacity to do so, its ability to do so, then individual obligations related to climate change should also be grounded in such a capacity, because individuals also have such a capacity. It's not that individuals are only able to avoid doing harm and nothing more, they are also able to do good. So that consideration, capacity to do good, as a consideration that can ground a moral obligation, applies to individuals just as much as to governments. Okay, so that's the first reason. Second reason, the private sphere, which I should now characterize as the sphere of kind of one-to-one or one-to-private organization, private defined kind of legally in that sense, transactions and interactions and so on, so not kind of state-level public policy. The private sphere in that sense is regulated and permitted and in some cases subsidized by the state. So the private sphere is itself kind of already defined and limited by the state. This means that the private sphere is kind of causally and even constitutively connected to the public sphere, and the same is true in the other direction. So as I'll go on to talk about in a minute, the public sphere is can only have the kind of shape that it does if it's underpinned by norms in the private sphere that endorse that kind of public sphere. Otherwise you'll get a kind of a social revolution or the breakdown of democracy. So these 2 spheres are both kind of causally and constitutively interlinked. And that, I think, suggests that the ethical principle should be interlinked too, rather than saying, well, individuals just have to not do harm or have to cultivate certain kind of virtues, whereas governments have to kind of take on the heavy burden of really doing good. Okay. Third reason why the public-private distinction, I think, breaks down in the case of climate ethics or climate justice is that norms, the norms that we learn growing up and the norms that we operate with as adults, don't neatly divide into private actions and public actions. And norms affect a lot of the behaviors that we perform in everyday life. So as just one example of this, seemingly private actions that we perform propagate or encourage certain norms, certain, well, I'll define norms in a minute, but let me have that as a placeholder for now. Certain actions in the private sphere propagate certain norms, and this is going to have effects on other private actors' views of what's politically acceptable. So in this way, how we behave in the private sphere affects political possibility via affecting norms. Okay, last but not least, this is in direct parallel to Oken, the private sphere creates barriers to participation in the public sphere. So to illustrate this, government action on climate change to do with kind of heavy duty carbon pricing or other kinds of mitigation strategies are only going to be possible if you have in democracies, if you have people voting and petitioning and protesting for those actions. But those voting, petitioning and protesting actions are not going to be feasible if an individual spends all her effort focusing on not doing harm or on cultivating certain private sphere virtues around her own kind of clean consumption and clean hands and minimizing her own involvement in the carbon intensive economy that we live in. So if you focus just on your own individual actions, you leave no room for the kinds of behaviours like voting and protesting and petitioning that are going to be necessary for the public sphere actions that are required alongside private sphere action. Okay, so we should reject the public-private distinction in climate ethics. I imagine that's probably a little bit preaching to the choir at a social ontology conference, but I think it's worth saying because many authors, I think, in the climate ethics and climate justice debate seem to sharply distinguish what I as an individual should do from what my state should do. Broome just being one prominent example. Okay, so what should individuals do instead if this focus on clean hands and minimising our own consumption or particular offsetting is problematic? So I want to argue that focusing on social norms has several advantages. So first of all, what are social norms? I made a promissory note that I would characterise these. So as I understand them here, we follow social norms because of what others will think of us or will do to us if we don't follow those norms. So this importantly does not mean that we consciously think about what others will think of us or will do to us if we don't follow the norms. So Charlotte Witt has a great concept called normative pull, where we kind of just intrinsically desire to follow the social norms. We feel the pull of them without really thinking about why, in particular, without thinking about what others will think of us or will do to us if we don't follow the norm. So I definitely buy into all of that, but nonetheless, we can feel the normative pull, and it can still be true that others' thoughts and actions or potential thoughts and actions are the kind of underlying cause of our conformity with the norm. And that's what makes it a social norm, rather than merely what the theory calls a custom or sort of a regularity in behaviour, something that I do for a reason other than what others will think of me, or something that I do because I think it's a objective moral norm. Okay, so that's what causes us to abide by social norms. The content of social norms, I assume, is grounded in how things are done around here. This is a formulation that I get from Brennan et al. In their 2013 book. So social norms content is not determined by their followers' beliefs or other attitudes towards moral norms, for example. They're rather just grounded in, well, this is how we do things, and that's kind of the rock bottom in terms of determining social norms content. Okay, I'm assuming that in this paper, and I hope that that's an ecumenical account, but I'm happy to be pressed on it in the comments. Okay, right, so that's what social norms are. Why should we focus on them when it comes to our climate-related obligations? Well, first simple reason is that social norms are implicated across the private-public spectrum, as was demonstrated in the third point on the previous slide. Also, social norms are a key vehicle by which we can abide by the three obligations that I've mentioned already. So I've mentioned obligations not to harm, which Broome attributes to individuals, obligations to do good, which Broome attributes to governments, and I've mentioned obligations not to benefit from an injustice, which I attributed to current offsetters. So these three obligations all relate importantly to social norms. So current social norms permit emitting, so they permit doing harm. They praise offsetting, so they praise benefiting from injustice. And as I hope is pretty clear, we can do good by changing norms towards something better. So social norms are kind of bound up with all three of these obligations in this way. And so by addressing norms, we can kind of address all three obligations, kill three birds with one stone. Okay, that's the initial case for social norms. I've got a bunch more reasons on the next slide, which I'm going to run through really quickly in the interest of time. So first, social norms content can be general enough to hold across the public-private spectrum, because social norms often demand a pattern of actions where that pattern can mean differently situated people perform different actions. So the pattern can be kind of general across the public-private spectrum. So their content is nicely general in that way. Not only is norms content general, but the obligation to promote norms is general as well, in the sense that it's flexible across different contexts. And here you can see the contrast with an obligation to reduce your individual consumption. So often reducing individual consumption will be a way to promote environmental social norms, obviously, but not always, because sometimes an individual consumption choice will be perceived by others to be virtue signaling or self-righteousness or what have you. It won't actually do the work of promoting a norm in favor of that kind of consumption. So an obligation to promote norms then is flexible across different contexts. It's not always going to mandate consuming in a particular way or offsetting, and it's certainly not going to mandate doing so without telling anyone about it. Because if you do those things without telling anyone about it, or if those things are taken in the wrong way, it's not going to promote the relevant social norm. Okay, third, as is well known in the literature on social norms, changing norms is better for changing behavior than is economic sanctions. I won't comment any more on that one, just in the interest of time. Fourth, changing norms is a crucial, important, sometimes seemingly necessary step to changing laws. Laws, at least in democracies, can't be changed without a perceived public mandate, and if there's a norm that presses in favour of that policy, that's one way of generating such a mandate. Fifth, the focus on social norms fits with social psychological research on climate change. So Whitmarsh et al. Talk about carbon capability, and they define carbon capable individuals as those who seek to influence through collective and political mechanisms. Now, you might think the psychologist is wrong about what it means to be carbon capable, but I think it's at least a kind of a good making result of our philosophical theory of individual climate ethics meshed in with our psychological theory. And notice that influencing through collective and political mechanisms there, they don't necessarily mean kind of the formal mechanisms of politics. They mean more general things like, being a norm entrepreneur, that kind of stuff. Okay. Sixth, finally, norms make policies stable. So under the fourth point on this slide, I emphasize that norms are a step to changing laws. It's also true that once you have a law in place, that law is going to be more stable, more robust, if there's a norm in favor of it. So that's another good reason for focusing on norms. Okay. One more point in favor of norms. So this is actually perhaps the most original point on this slide, I think. Much current high emissions behavior isn't directly a social norm. So it's not, I think, currently the case in industrialized societies that there's a social norm positively in favor of high emissions. Rather, high emissions is a custom. So it's something that individuals do, for example, for their own self-interest because it's cheaper, for example. It's not something they do because of what others will think of them if they don't do it. Or high emissions behavior might be kind of contingently connected to norms. So maybe there's a norm in favor of going on holiday overseas, or there's a norm in favor of driving the latest car. But these things are only contingently connected to high emissions behavior. In the case of overseas travel, it's pretty robustly contingently connected. But nonetheless, if we can disentangle the norm in favor of traveling or owning the latest car from the emission, then we can keep the norm but change the connection to emissions. And even if there is actually a social norm that is directly and kind of intrinsically in favor of high emissions, still, if that's a social norm rather than a moral norm, which I think it is, then our prospects of changing it are better. So all of that is to say, under this point 7, that changing social norms or promoting social norms that are more climate friendly is perhaps more feasible than you might think, because high emissions behavior, some of it's a custom, some of it's only contingently connected to social norms, and even for the parts of it that really are a social norm, it's at least not a moral norm. So it's not that people think there's some objective moral truth that mandates high emissions, for example. That would make it really hard to change that norm. Okay. All right, and I want to finally close by saying something a little more concrete. I go into more detail in the written version of this paper, which I'm happy to send anyone who's interested. But I want to say something a little more concrete about what content of social norms we might want to aim for. And I want to suggest that anti-fossil fuel norms specifically have several advantages. So if we're thinking that the individual obligation is to promote norms, if you're promoting norms that target your own behavior, like your own consumption behavior, then that's very demanding. Your obligation is to promote a norm that sanctions your own behavior. So it seems to me like a better alternative is to say that the obligation is to promote norms that target large organizations. So the obligation then is to promote norms against extracting and burning fossil fuels, and to promote norms against funding or investing in those who extract or burn fossil fuels, where these norms, the extracting, the burning, the funding, the investing, are behaviours of large organisations that we target. And these norms have the further advantage that they're underpinned by a moral norm with wide currency, that is the moral norm of not recklessly causing large-scale harm. And this, I think, overcomes the seeming kind of diffuseness and distance of climate harms. And I will have to leave it there. Looking forward to your comments, I hope. Thank you.